What if the problem of political obligation can't be solved? To check that we fully understand the problem of political obligation, it's helpful to think about the consequences of it being unsolvable. Suppose then that the problem of political obligation can't be solved. What would follow from that? Well, if the problem of political obligation can't be solved, then philosophical anarchism is true. Philosophical anarchists are much less revolutionary than political anarchists. Political anarchists typically think that states are illegitimate and should be overthrown. By contrast, philosophical anarchists simply hold that we don't have an obligation to obey the law. They needn't have a view about whether we ought to resist or overthrow the state, and they typically grant that we might have very good reasons to comply with the law, reasons such as the cost to ourselves and to other people if we break it. Philosophical anarchists hold that we don't have an obligation to obey the law. We don't have an obligation to do what the law commands because the law commands it. One question on which philosophical anarchists are divided is whether we ever could have an obligation to obey the law. Is it merely true as things currently are that we have no obligation to obey the law? Or could we never have an obligation to obey the law under any circumstances? This is an interesting issue because it takes us back to the question of what states are like. Is it somehow in the nature of what a state is that we can't have an obligation to obey the law? Could there ever be a group of citizens who established a state and have an obligation to obey its laws? What would such a state have to be like for this to be possible? So this shows how questions about political obligation are tied to interesting philosophical questions about the nature of states and why and when they're legitimate.